blood moon, the curse of the werewolf. The Lunar Empress was the kind of ship that promised an unforgettable experience. Towering decks, elegant ballrooms, pools glistening beneath the open sky. It was a floating paradise, a beacon of luxury drifting toward exotic destinations. But beneath its shimmering exterior, something ancient stirred. The Voyage was supposed to be a celebration, a 5-day cruise across the Atlantic under the rare super blood moon. Passengers laughed, drank, and danced as the ship slowly left the harbor, oblivious to the cursed waters beneath them. As the sky darkened, the moon began to rise, too large, too red, too an omen in the sky. On the upper deck, Emma Carter, a travel blogger with over 1 million followers, adjusted her camera to capture the scenery. But when she turned her lens toward the moon, her hands trembled. It wasn't just red, it was bleeding. A faint dripping sound filled her ears. At first, she thought it was just the water lapping against the ship. But no, it was coming from above. She lowered the camera, heart pounding. The other passengers carried on, oblivious to the slow, thick drops of crimson falling from the sky, vanishing before they touched the deck. "Must be my imagination," she muttered. But the unease in her chest refused to fade. The captain's dread. Deep inside the ship, Captain Elias Monroe poured himself a stiff drink. Something about this voyage felt wrong. It had started before they even left port. Some of the crew members had vanished, their contracts still in the system, their personal belongings still on board, but they were simply gone. When security checked their rooms, the air was ice cold, and the mirrors were covered in strange handprints. No explanation, no resignations, just disappeared. And now, as he stared out at the unnatural moon, a voice in his head whispered, "You never should have left shore." The music that shouldn't be there. In the grand ballroom, the orchestra played, and couples swayed beneath golden chandeliers. But somewhere beneath the waltz, a new sound crept in. It was a slow, ragged breathing. Low growls. The pianist faltered. His fingers stiffened, his breathing shallow. His reflection in the piano's polished surface did not match his movements. The violinist's bow snapped in half. The cello let out a deep, inhuman moan. Guests whispered, confused, but no one stopped dancing. The air thickened, a strange pressure pushing against the walls. Then, the lights flickered. For just a second, the entire room was plunged into darkness. And in that brief moment, every mirror in the ballroom rippled, like something was moving on the other side. Lost at sea. Already up in the navigation room, First Officer James Holloway frowned at the radar. "We're off course," he muttered. "Impossible." The helmsman replied, "We're on a straight line to..." The radar flickered, then cut to black. The GPS was gone. James turned toward the window, his breath caught in his throat. There was no horizon, no stars, only red mist swirling like living veins across an endless black sea. The Lunar Empress was no longer sailing on Earth's waters. It had crossed into something else. The howl in the depths. Down in the crew's quarters, engineer Luis Alvarez checked the engines. The machinery purred as expected, but the walls felt different, softer, as if something inside the ship was breathing. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl from behind the metal bulkhead. The kind of sound that didn't belong on a cruise ship. The kind of sound a predator makes before it kills. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second he saw something move inside the walls. Something huge, something that had too many eyes. Then, the growl turned into a howl. The moon watches, the ship hungers. On deck, Emma felt the temperature drop. Her breath came out in visible puffs. She pulled her jacket tighter, and then she saw them. The crew members who had vanished. They stood at the very edge of the ship, facing the sea. Motionless, their clothes torn, their skin pale and stretched too tight over their bones, and their eyes were all black. They turned their heads in unison, staring straight at her. A slow smile spread across their faces, too wide, too unnatural. And then they jumped, one by one, silently, into the dark waters below. Emma screamed. Others on the deck ran to the railing, but when they looked over, the ocean was empty. No bodies, no splashes, no ripples in the water. Just the blood moon's reflection staring back, and for a split second, it blinked. The nightmare begins. The ship lurched, as if something enormous had just grabbed hold of it from beneath. All across the vessel, passengers and crew froze, their bodies suddenly racked with a terrible cold. A deep rumbling echoed from the hull. A sound older than time, older than man. And then, from the lowest decks, a single, inhuman howl tore through the ship. Passengers screamed, lights shattered, and the Lunar Empress sailed deeper into hell. The Lunar Empress drifted in eerie silence. The air was thick, pressing against the passengers like an invisible weight. The ballroom music had stopped. The laughter, the chatter, all of it had vanished. And somewhere deep in the lower decks, something had awakened. A corpse that shouldn't move. Down in the ship's medical bay, Dr. Adrian Collins stood over the body of a crew member, Daniel Grayson, an engineer. At least, what was left of him. His body lay on the examination table, twisted, his bones at impossible angles. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream, his eyes wide and glassy. His skin was wrong, too tight, too dry, almost as if it had been sucked from the inside. Adrian swallowed. The man had been found near the engine room, collapsed, his body still warm, yet he was dead. No heartbeat, no pulse. So why did his fingertips twitch? A nurse let out a small gasp. "Did you see that?" Adrian stepped back. The body was changing. The skin darkened, veins turning black. The bones cracked, shifting, moving. A horrible tearing sound filled the air as Daniel's chest expanded outward, the ribcage widening, bones stretching like they were being rearranged by an unseen hand. Then, with a sickening pop, his head snapped toward them. His eyes were no longer human, yellow, animalistic, and filled with a hunger that did not belong to this world. Then he moved, blood on the walls. The ship's security team responded quickly. 2 officers stormed into the medical bay, guns raised. "Step away," one shouted. But the thing on the table was no longer Daniel Grayson. With a guttural, inhuman snarl, the corpse lunged, bones snapping, muscles tearing, its mouth stretching too wide, filled with jagged, unnatural teeth. The first officer fired. The bullet tore through Daniel's chest, but he didn't stop. He didn't even bleed. Instead, he laughed, a wet, gurgling, inhuman sound. Then, he tore the officer's throat out with his teeth. Blood splattered the walls. The second officer tried to run, but Daniel moved too fast, too unnatural. His body elongated, his limbs stretching, fingers ending in clawed, bone-white talons. By the time the screaming stopped, the medical bay was painted red. Dr. Collins stood in the corner, trembling, as the thing that was once Daniel Grayson turned its yellow, glowing eyes toward him. The infection spreads up on the main deck. Passengers were still unaware of what had just happened. The ship's PA system crackled to life, static. Then, "Attention, crew and passengers." The voice was wrong, warped, layered, as if more than one person was speaking. "The storm has delayed our voyage. Please remain calm. Do not look at the moon." Then the static surged, turning into a deep, rumbling growl. The speakers exploded, raining sparks onto the terrified passengers. Then the screams began. From the upper balconies, from the hallways, from everywhere. Something was hunting them. The moon calls them. Inside cabin 617, a teenage girl named Lucy Marshall gripped the edges of the sink, staring into the mirror. Her hands were trembling. Her reflection wasn't right. Her eyes, they glowed. Her skin itched, burned. Beneath it, something shifted. Her breathing grew ragged. Something was whispering in her head, a voice not her own. "Let it out." She clamped her hands over her ears. "Stop. Then her fingernails fell off. Blood oozed from her fingertips. But beneath them, new claws were already forming, sharp, curved, not human. Her jaw cracked, widening, her spine arched backward. Then the pain became too much. Lucy let out a scream, but it came out as a howl. No escape. The captain stood in the bridge, staring at the ship's radar. It wasn't working. The ocean outside was black, the sky filled with thick, swirling clouds, hiding the blood moon. But the worst part? There were no stars, no horizon. The ship was no longer in the Atlantic. "Sir," a crewman whispered, "where are we?" The captain didn't answer, because the truth was, they were nowhere. And then, the howling started, from the decks below, from the hallways, from inside the walls. The passengers weren't just being attacked, they were becoming something else, one by one. And the blood moon was still rising. The Lunar Empress was no longer a luxury cruise ship. It was a floating nightmare. The infection was spreading too fast. Passengers and crew screamed in agony as their bodies twisted, their bones cracking, their flesh stretching into something inhuman. The air reeked of blood, sweat, and something ancient. Something that had waited centuries to return. The ship groaned under the weight of monsters being born, and the blood moon watched it all from above. a deck drenched in gore. On the main deck, Emma Carter clutched the railing, her breath coming in sharp gasps. All around her, people changed. The woman who had been standing next to her minutes ago, Mrs. Langley, a retired teacher from Ohio, was now on all fours, her fingers elongating into claws, her teeth bared in a permanent snarl. Her mouth foamed as she ripped out a man's throat with her teeth. Emma screamed. The infected passengers weren't human anymore. They were something else, not just werewolves, something worse. Their bodies were elongated, twisted, stretched too far. Their spines bulged, their rib cages cracked open, exposing organs that glowed with an eerie, pulsating light. And worst of all, they were still aware, trapped inside their mutating, monstrous forms. Their eyes, now bright yellow, flickered with recognition, with horror. Some of them were still trying to scream, but their new mouths could only howl. Nowhere is safe down in the crew quarters. Security Officer Tobias Grant held his gun in shaking hands. He was the last one left. His entire squad had been ripped apart by something too fast to see. Blood dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the floor. The walls shuddered like something was breathing inside them. Then, a footstep. Tobias spun around. "Who's there?" Silence. Then from the darkness, a voice whispered, "You can't hide." His blood ran cold. It was his own voice. Then, a clawed hand shot out of the shadows. It grabbed Tobias by the throat and lifted him off the ground. As he struggled, he saw its face. It was him, or what he was becoming. A monstrous, elongated version of himself, a twisted, horrific reflection, and it smiled. Then it dug its claws into his chest. Tobias let out a final, choked scream before his own doppelganger ripped him in half. A message from the dead. On the upper decks, Captain Elias Monroe and First Officer James Holloway barricaded themselves in the bridge. The windows were fogged, as if something was breathing on the glass from the outside. The ship was drifting without direction. No land, no stars, just an endless black void. The radio crackled, a voice, distant, garbled. "Lunar Empress, do you copy? This is..." The captain grabbed the receiver. "This is Captain Monroe. Please, God, tell me you can hear me." Static. Then, "You never should have set sail." The voice wasn't human. It was layered, deep, guttural, ancient. Then the glass cracked. Captain Monroe turned. Something was outside the bridge. Something crawling up the side of the ship. Something too big to be real. Then a clawed hand smashed through the window. And the bridge went dark. The blood moon's gift. In cabin 617, Lucy Marshall sat in a pool of her own blood. She wasn't human anymore. Her skin had peeled away, revealing something black and pulsating underneath. Her jaw had stretched, her eyes had melted into two glowing pits of yellow fire. Her bones no longer belonged to her. She wasn't Lucy anymore. She was something new, something hungry. The voice in her head whispered, "The blood moon is your mother now." Then, with a twisted smile, she stepped out of the cabin, ready to hunt. The ship is no longer a ship. The Lunar Empress had changed. The walls were moving, the floors were warped, the metal itself pulsed as if alive. It wasn't just the people who were infected. The ship itself was transforming. And deep in the hull, something massive was waking up. Something that had been waiting beneath the ocean for centuries. Something that wasn't human. Something that was about to be reborn. The Lunar Empress was no longer just a ship. It had become a womb for something monstrous. The infection was spreading faster than anyone could escape. The walls moved, breathing like lungs. The floors pulsed as if veins ran beneath them. And below deck, something ancient was waking up. Something that had waited for centuries. The blood moon was calling it home. The screaming walls. The lower decks were no longer safe. They had changed. Michael Everett, a bartender, ran down a corridor that shouldn't exist. The walls were too close. They twisted, turned, narrowed. Doors that had been there minutes ago were gone, and the screaming, it was coming from inside the walls. Michael stopped, panting. He looked back. The hallway behind him was gone. In its place was a black void, stretching endlessly. Then, a voice whispered in his ear, "You're already dead." Michael spun around. There was something standing in the dark, something huge, tall, wrong. It had too many eyes, too many teeth, and it was smiling. Then, the walls opened up like a mouth, and Michael was gone. The ship is eating them. Dr. Adrian Collins staggered through the blood-soaked corridors. The medical bay was gone, consumed. The bodies of the dead were melting into the ship itself. Hands grew from the walls. Eyes blinked from the ceiling. and the voices, whispers, howls, sobs filled the air. He saw what was left of Tobias Grant, or what had replaced him. Tobias's face was stretched into the wall. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Dr. Collins backed away. Then Tobias's eyes moved, and he started screaming. No escape from the moon. Up on the main deck, Emma Carter and a handful of survivors tried to get to the lifeboats. They were the last ones left. The rest of the passengers were gone. Or worse, they weren't passengers anymore. Emma reached the railing, her heart pounding. The lifeboats were still there. But the ocean wasn't. It was black, not dark, empty, as if the ship was floating in nothing. Then one of the other survivors, a man named Eric, let out a strangled gasp. Emma turned. His shadow had grown. It stretched across the deck, longer, sharper. Then it stood up. His own shadow reached out and grabbed him. Eric screamed, and then he was gone, swallowed by his own darkness. The thing in the hull. Below the engines, beyond the flooded storage rooms, there was a door that had never been part of the Lunar Empress's design, a door that shouldn't exist. Captain Monroe stood before it, shaking. The metal was breathing. Something on the other side was alive. The first officer, or what was left of him, stood beside him. His skin was stretched too tight, his fingers had fused into claws, but his eyes were still human. Tears ran down his face. "Captain," he whispered, "it's awake." Then the door opened, and they saw it. It has been waiting. The thing inside the hull was not a werewolf. It was something older, something that had been waiting beneath the ocean for centuries. It had no true form. It was all bone and fur and eyes and mouths, shifting, moving, expanding. It was the first of them, the one that had created the curse. And now, it was free. Captain Monroe's breath caught in his throat. He tried to look away, but it was inside him now. Inside the ship. Inside everything. Then, the walls exploded. The thing rose, and the blood moon burned brighter. It's too late. Emma Carter stood at the edge of the ship, watching the ocean vanish into blackness. The sky swirled with crimson light. The last of the survivors fell to their knees, convulsing. The infection had won. Emma felt her own bones crack. Her skin burned. Her reflection in the shattered window was no longer her own. The blood moon had chosen her. Then, from deep inside the ship, a howl rose. A howl that did not belong to this world. And the Lunar Empress disappeared, swallowed by the endless black ocean. The Lunar Empress no longer existed in the world it once knew. It had been swallowed by something else. The ocean beneath it was black as tar, endless as the void. The sky was a swirling mass of red clouds, with the blood moon hanging like an open wound above the ship. And on board, there was nothing human left. The infection had won. But the transformation wasn't finished yet. Because this was never about werewolves. This was about something far worse. The last flicker of humanity. Emma Carter clutched the railing of the upper deck, her breathing ragged. Her body wasn't hers anymore. Her fingernails had turned into black talons. Her skin had split in places, revealing something hard, coarse, and unnatural beneath. Her spine felt too long. Her heartbeat was no longer a rhythm. It was a pulsing throb that echoed with something ancient. She turned to the last survivors. There were only 4 of them left. And they were all changing. Eric's face was contorted, his mouth stretching, his jaw unhinging like a snake's. His eyes burned yellow, and when he opened his mouth to speak, only a gurgling, guttural howl came out. Dr. Collins was on his knees, clutching his head. His bones snapped audibly, one by one, like branches breaking in a storm. And Lucy? Lucy was already gone. Her body was still there, but her soul had left. Her eyes were just black pits, and her fingers had stretched into something inhumanly long. She stared at Emma, unblinking, and whispered, "He is coming." Then she lunged. The Devourer awakens. Deep in the hull, beneath the twisted remains of the engine room, Captain Monroe was still alive. But not for much longer. He stood in a chamber that shouldn't exist. A vast, endless pit stretched before him, filled with writhing, moving flesh. The walls pulsed. The floor was alive, and something was rising. The Devourer. It had been buried beneath the ocean for centuries, waiting for the blood moon to return, waiting for a vessel to carry it back into the world. And now it had one. The Lunar Empress was no longer a ship. It was its new body. And the werewolves weren't its children. They were just the beginning. Monroe took a step back. The thing in the pit moved. It was made of everything that had ever been consumed. A mass of bone, fur, eyes, and mouths. It was a god of hunger, and it was waking up, no escape. Emma ducked as Lucy's claws slashed through the air. Lucy was no longer a person. She had become something else entirely. Her mouth had split open all the way to her ears. Her bones had twisted and reformed. Her legs were now digitigrade, bending backward like an animal's, and her voice was not her own anymore. "You can't run. The moon has chosen you." Emma turned and ran. The deck was no longer solid. It was soft, pulsing, breathing. The ship was alive. The Lunar Empress had become part of the Devourer, and it was taking them all with it. The ocean is no longer an ocean. Dr. Collins staggered to the edge of the ship. He looked overboard. There was no water anymore, just blackness, a sea of living shadows twisting and churning. Then it looked back at him. Hundreds of yellow eyes blinked open beneath the surface. And then the hands came. They shot up from the depths, grabbing at him, pulling him over the railing. He didn't even have time to scream. He was dragged under. The black ocean swallowed him whole. And then he was gone. The Lunar Empress is leaving this world. The ship wasn't sinking, it was ascending. Into the sky? No. Into something else. The world around them was unraveling. Reality itself was breaking apart. The stars above them vanished. The sky became nothing but swirling red mist. And then the ship cracked open like an egg. And from within, the Devourer stepped out, towering, writhing, endless. The first werewolf, the god of hunger, the blood moon's true master. And now, it was free. Emma felt her mind shatter. Then, the Lunar Empress was gone and the world screamed. The Lunar Empress was gone. Not sunk, not destroyed. It had been consumed, swallowed by something older than time. And now, the world was breaking apart. The sky was no longer a sky. The ocean was no longer an ocean. The blood moon was all that remained, and beneath its light, the Devourer walked. What was left of them? Emma Carter was still alive. But she wasn't Emma anymore. Her skin had peeled away, revealing something thick, dark, and unnatural beneath. Her teeth had multiplied into rows of jagged fangs. Her shadow moved on its own. She stood on nothing. The world around her had dissolved into a swirling, shifting abyss of black mist and crimson light. She turned. The last survivors were no longer survivors. Eric's body had split in half from the mouth down, but he still stood. His arms were too long now, dragging across the ground. His eyes had burned out of his skull, replaced by glowing pits of hunger. Lucy was on all fours. Her spine had stretched, her ribcage bursting open, but she was still alive, still whispering, "He walks now, he walks now, he walks now." Emma stumbled back. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. She was afraid of what was coming, because she could feel it. The Devourer was here, and the world would never be the same again. The first step into oblivion. The sky split open. A howl that was not a howl erupted from the darkness, a sound that wasn't meant for human ears. It was too deep, too vast, too hungry, and then it stepped through. The Devourer was not a werewolf. It was not a god. It was the end of everything. Its body was made of thousands of shifting forms, wolves, humans, things that had never existed before. It had no true shape. It was a wound in reality, a thing that should never have been allowed to wake. And now it was walking forward. Each step erased the world beneath it. It was not devouring. It was unmaking. No more sky, no more earth. Captain Monroe floated in the void. He had survived the collapse of the ship, but survival didn't matter anymore, because there was nothing left to survive. He saw what had become of the others. He saw their bodies twist, stretch, and merge. They were no longer people, no longer werewolves. They had become part of something bigger, part of the Devourer's body. And soon, so would he. He turned, his last breath catching in his throat, because the blood moon was descending. It was no longer a moon. It was an eye, and it was watching him. Then it blinked, and Captain Monroe was gone. Emma's final choice. Emma was the last one. Her body was already changing. She could feel the Devourer inside her. It was pulling her in. It wanted her to join, to become part of it, to let go. She looked at her hands. They were no longer hands. Her skin was no longer skin. She had only seconds left. And then she heard the voice. "You were chosen." It was not the Devourer. It was something else, something deep inside her, something that hadn't been consumed yet, a final dying ember of humanity. And in that moment, Emma made her choice. She opened her mouth, and she howled. Not like a werewolf, not like a monster, but like a survivor, like someone who refused to be erased. And for the first time, The devourer hesitated. The battle for existence. The sky was breaking apart. The world was gone, but something was still fighting. Something inside Emma was still holding on. The devourer turned to her. It had never known resistance before. It had never known defiance. And now it was angry. The final battle had begun, and Emma Carter was the only thing left standing between reality and total annihilation. The devourer lunged, and Emma screamed, not in fear, but in rage. And everything exploded. There was nothing left. No ocean, no sky, no time. Only the devourer, only the blood moon, and one last survivor. Emma Carter stood at the edge of existence, and she wasn't human anymore, not fully, but she was also not the devourer, not yet. She was something in between, and in that moment, she realized something. She could still fight. The devourer's rage. The thing that had once been the Lunar Empress towered over her. It had no true form, just a shifting mass of fur, fangs, claws, and writhing bodies. Every person from the ship was now part of it. Their faces merged into its flesh, screaming silently, their souls devoured, their minds gone. All except for one. Emma could still hear them, trapped, begging, fighting to be free. And the devourer knew it. It turned its many heads toward her, and it spoke. Not in words, but in pure hunger. A voice that shattered bones, a voice that could unmake reality itself. Join. Emma staggered. Her legs bent backward. Her hands cracked open, becoming claws. Her body wasn't hers anymore. The devourer was pulling her in, turning her into one of its own. And for a moment, she almost gave in. Almost. The last flicker of humanity. Something inside her refused, a memory. Her mother's voice. You are stronger than your fear. Her father's laughter. Never stop fighting, no matter what. The way the sun felt on her skin before the storm began. She held on to it, clawed her way back. And for the first time, the devourer recoiled. Because something inside Emma was still human. Still alive, and it was fighting back. The final stand. The blood moon burned brighter. The devourer roared. Reality itself began to crack, and Emma ran, not away, toward it. She lunged, her claws sinking into its flesh. And for the first time, the devourer felt pain. It howled, a sound that shook the void, a sound of rage, a sound of fear. Because Emma wasn't just resisting, she was destroying it. The last howl, Emma's body was no longer hers, but her will was, and she pushed back, clawing, tearing, fighting, until the faces inside the devourer began to emerge. The lost souls, Eric, Lucy, Captain Monroe, everyone, and they screamed, not in pain, but in defiance. The devourer began to break, its body splitting apart, its hunger turning into fear. Emma threw back her head and she howled, one final deafening howl. A sound that ripped the blood moon from the sky. A sound that ended the nightmare. A sound that brought the world back. The morning after, Emma woke up on the deck of the Lunar Empress. The ocean was calm, the sky was blue, the ship was whole, and the blood moon was gone. She sat up, gasping. Her body was her own again. The werewolves were gone. The devourer was gone. Everything was back to normal, or so it seemed. Because when she looked down at her hands, her nails were still claws, her teeth were still too sharp, and deep inside her, the hunger still remained. The devourer was gone, but its curse had not died. And Emma Carter was no longer just a survivor. She was the last werewolf, the last piece of the blood moon, and it would rise again, someday, somewhere. And when it did, Emma would have to choose. Would she fight it, or would she become it? Only time would tell.